It's a story etched into the very land itself, a story of defiance, of a people who looked at the sea not as an enemy, but as a highway to the world. Here, in the Low Countries, a sliver of Europe wrestled from the North Sea, something extraordinary was born. The Dutch Republic, a place forged in the fires of an 80-year war for independence against the mighty Spanish Empire. It wasn't just a nation, it was an idea that a small, waterlogged country, with few natural resources to its name, could stand tall among giants. This wasn't a kingdom ruled by the whims of a monarch, but a republic of merchants, sailors, and engineers, whose wealth was built on grit, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief in their own destiny. This was the dawn of the Dutch Golden Age, the 17th century. So how did they do it? How did this small republic, this upstart nation, come to dominate the world's oceans? The answer lies in their ships. Not just any ships, but a revolutionary vessel called the Fluit. You can just picture it, a stocky, round-bellied ship, designed not for war, but for profit. Their genius wasn't confined to shipbuilding. They revolutionized finance, creating institutions that were centuries ahead of their time. In 1609, they established the Bank of Amsterdam, the world's first ever central bank. It provided stability and reliability in a chaotic financial world, making Amsterdam the safest place to keep your money. And then there was the herring. It sounds simple, doesn't it? A small, silvery fish, but herring was the oil of its day. The Dutch developed a new method of curing the fish at sea, a process called gibbing. It meant their fishing fleets could stay out for weeks, catching and preserving vast quantities. If you want to understand the Dutch Empire, you have to understand the VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company. It wasn't just a company, it was a state within a state. Founded in 1602, it was the world's first multinational corporation, and it was given powers that are staggering to think about today. The Dutch government granted it a 21-year monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. More than that, the VOC could wage war, negotiate treaties, coin its own money, and establish colonies. It had its own army, its own navy, and its own laws. The company's primary target was the fabled Spice Islands, the Moluccas, in what is now Indonesia. For centuries, spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace were worth more than their weight in gold in Europe. The trade had been dominated by the Portuguese, who jealously guarded the secret routes. The Dutch arrived with a ruthless efficiency that shocked their rivals. Their methods were brutal. To secure their monopoly, they were prepared to do anything. On the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg, they faced resistance from the local population who insisted on trading with the English. In 1621, the VOC's Governor-General, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, enacted a horrific solution. He ordered the massacre or deportation of almost the entire population of the islands, some 15,000 people. Halfway along the treacherous sea route to the East Indies lay a place of vital strategic importance, the southern tip of Africa. For sailors who had spent months at sea, battling scurvy and storms, it was a godsend. A place to rest, repair their battered ships, and replenish their supplies of fresh water and food. In 1652, the VOC, in its typically pragmatic fashion, decided to establish a permanent refreshment station here. They sent a man named Jan van Riebeeck, not to build a colony, but to plant a garden. But outposts have a way of growing. The initial settlement at Table Bay, named Cape Town, soon expanded. The company encouraged a small number of its employees, known as free burghers, to leave its service and start farming the land to supply the station with wheat and wine. The impact on the local populations was catastrophic. As the Dutch settlement expanded, it encroached on the traditional grazing lands of the pastoral Khoikhoi people. Conflict was inevitable. The Dutch, with their firearms and organized military structure, had a decisive advantage. The Khoikhoi were pushed off their land, devastated by new diseases like smallpox to which they had no immunity, and forced into servitude on the white-owned farms. The Dutch gaze wasn't fixed solely on the East. They saw immense opportunity in the Americas too, an arena dominated by their Spanish and Portuguese rivals. They established the Dutch West India Company, or WIC, as a counterpart to the VOC, to challenge Iberian power in the New World. In 1609, the explorer Henry Hudson, an Englishman working for the Dutch, sailed up a magnificent river in search of a northwest passage to Asia. He didn't find it, but he did find a land rich in timber and, crucially, beavers. The Dutch established a series of trading posts along what is now the Hudson River, culminating in a settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. They called it New Amsterdam. Further south in the Caribbean, the Dutch carved out a different kind of empire. They seized a string of small, strategically important islands like Curaçao, Aruba, and Sint Maarten. Curaçao, with its superb natural harbor, became a major hub in the transatlantic slave trade, a depot where enslaved Africans were brought before being sold on to plantations across the Americas. Life in the Dutch colonies was a world away from the orderly canals of Amsterdam. It was a life of extremes, of immense wealth and desperate poverty, of opportunity and brutal exploitation. For the Dutch farmer, the Boer at the Cape of Good Hope, life was one of hard toil and isolation. He lived on a vast, sprawling farm, often days of travel from his nearest neighbor. For the enslaved, life was a relentless nightmare. Whether on a sugar plantation in Suriname, a nutmeg grove in the Banda Islands, or a wheat farm at the Cape, their existence was one of forced, unpaid labor, violence, and the complete denial of their humanity. They were considered property, chattels to be bought and sold. Families were torn apart, cultures were suppressed, and any act of resistance was met with savage punishment. The entire economic structure of the Dutch Empire, from the spices of the East to the sugar of the West, rested on the backs of millions of enslaved people. Their suffering is the untold story, the dark foundation upon which the Golden Age was built. And what of the local peoples who were not enslaved but simply ruled? Their lives were turned upside down. The Dutch presence disrupted traditional economies, imposed new laws and taxes, and often played local rulers off against one another to maintain control. No empire lasts forever. The very success of the Dutch Republic sowed the seeds of its own decline. Their staggering wealth and control over global trade bred envy and resentment among their European rivals, particularly England and France. The English in particular began to copy Dutch methods. They improved their own ships, strengthened their own financial systems, and passed laws, like the Navigation Acts, specifically designed to cripple Dutch dominance in shipping and trade. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a series of brutal Anglo-Dutch wars, fought not over territory in Europe, but for control of the world's sea lanes and colonial trade. In 1664, the English sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and captured it without a fight, renaming it New York. These wars took a heavy toll. The Netherlands was a small country with a small population. It could not match the manpower of larger nations like France or the industrial might of a rising Britain. The challenges weren't just external. The empire was vast, sprawling, and difficult to defend. From within, resistance to Dutch rule was a constant problem. In the East Indies, local rulers and communities frequently rose up in rebellion against the VOC's harsh monopolies and heavy-handed rule. By the late 18th century, the VOC, once the world's most powerful company, was rotten from within. When the French revolutionary armies invaded the Netherlands in 1795 and established a new government, the Batavian Republic, the game was up. In 1799, the once mighty VOC was formally dissolved. The fall of the VOC didn't mark the end of the Dutch Empire, but its transformation. The Napoleonic Wars were a disaster for the Netherlands. With the homeland occupied by France, its colonies were easy pickings for the British, who had naval supremacy. When the wars ended, and a new kingdom of the Netherlands was established in 1815, it got some of its colonies back, but the world had changed. The main remnant, and the new focus of Dutch colonial ambition, was the vast archipelago of the Dutch East Indies. The 19th century saw the Dutch state tighten its grip on these islands, moving from a system of indirect rule and trading posts to outright territorial conquest. They fought a long and bloody war to subdue the Sultanate of Aceh in northern Sumatra, a conflict that lasted for decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. They imposed a brutal system known as the cultivation system, which forced Javanese peasants to devote a large portion of their land and labor to growing cash crops like coffee and sugar for the Dutch government. A new Indonesian nationalist movement began to emerge in the early 20th century, inspired by ideas of self-determination and an end to foreign rule. The final death blow came with the Second World War. When the war ended in 1945, Indonesian leaders, led by Sukarno, declared independence. The Dutch, weakened by the war in Europe, tried to reclaim their prized colony, fighting a bitter and violent 4-year war, but they could not turn back the tide of history. In 1949, under intense international pressure, they finally recognized Indonesia's independence. With the loss of the Indies, the Dutch Empire effectively ceased to exist. The Dutch Empire may be gone, but its ghost lingers. You can hear it in the languages people speak. Afrikaans, one of the official languages of South Africa, is a direct descendant of the Dutch spoken by the first settlers at the Cape. In the Caribbean, the Dutch language still holds official status in Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten. And even in English, words like boss, cookie, yacht, and brandy are all imports from the Dutch, brought over during that intense period of rivalry and exchange. You can see the legacy in the very shape of the modern world. The global financial system we have today, with its stock markets, multinational corporations, and complex credit systems, has its roots in 17th century Amsterdam. The VOC was the prototype for the modern corporation, a private entity with global reach and immense power. The Dutch pioneered the legal and financial frameworks that made global capitalism possible. Of course, this legacy is also one of deep and painful scars. In Indonesia, South Africa, and Suriname, the memory of colonialism is one of exploitation, violence, and racial hierarchy. The economic and social inequalities created during the colonial era have proven stubbornly persistent, shaping the challenges these nations face today. In the Netherlands itself, there is a growing and often difficult conversation about this history. The Golden Age is no longer seen as simply a story of heroic merchants and brilliant artists, but also as a period built on slavery and colonial oppression. So when we look at the world today, we see the echoes of this small nation's incredible and often brutal journey. We see it in the names on our maps, from Brooklyn to Tasmania, named after the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman. We see it in the global trade networks that connect our continents. And we see it in the ongoing struggles for justice and equality that are the inheritance of all empires. The story of the Dutch Empire is a powerful reminder of how a tiny corner of the world can, for a brief brilliant moment, reshape the entire globe, leaving behind a legacy that is as complex and enduring as the tides themselves.